After changes on defense propelled the New Orleans Saints to a win against the Atlanta Falcons last week, new wrinkles on offense may be the story to watch against the Cleveland Browns. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as the Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're starting to turn our attention over to the Cleveland Browns. Their defense has not performed up to standard so far, but still a lot of talent on that side of the football. We'll break down the Cleveland Browns defense, what they like to do, where they struggle, all those. We'll also dive into the Cleveland Browns offense and who the biggest threat is on offense. And it is a very familiar face for the New Orleans Saints in quarterback Jameis Winston. We're going to lead everything off here today with a look at some new wrinkles the New Orleans Saints could be looking to implement on the offensive side of the football this week against Cleveland's defense. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us your first listen and for being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by friends over at FanDuel, where you can make the most out of this NFL season. New customers will put $5 down, and you'll get $150 in bonus bets back if you win your first $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. The New Orleans Saints implemented some changes, some wrinkles over on the defensive side of the football as coaching staff responsibilities, things like that have shifted for the team over the course of the last week. But I think it's the offensive side of the football we might want to put under a microscope as the Saints lead up to their next home game up against the Cleveland Browns ahead of the bye. I think that there's some shifts on offense, some wrinkles on offense that this team could look to implement to give them their next edge up against their next opponent. Now, when we talk about an edge, we're talking about is giving a team something that they haven't seen a lot of before. I don't know if you're necessarily going to be able to do that over on the offensive side, but I think that there are some things the Saints offense could get back to that they did early on in the season that could help them big time here against Cleveland. When you think about the Cleveland Browns, you think about their defense, a couple of names probably come to mind, but more than likely the name that consistently comes to mind is Miles Garrett and the threat that he presents as a pass rusher. Now, the team having moved Zadarius Smith over to Detroit certainly helps to alleviate a little bit of the pressure that they would otherwise be able to bring from either side of their defensive line. But obviously, Miles Garrett is somebody that can move around and wreak havoc. You want to safeguard yourself against that pass rusher as best as possible. So one of the best ways to do that is, well, not only protecting and doing a better job in pass protection or a good job in pass protection, instead, you probably want to lean in a little bit more to the run game. And when we think about the run game, we oftentimes, of course, go straight to Alvin Kamara. But I think Taysom Hill plays a big role in this matchup as well. There's something that the Saints did very heavily at the beginning of the season with Taysom Hill that they just have not done ever since. You look at the first 2 weeks of the season. Week 1, he took 12 snaps in the backfield. Week 2, he took 16 snaps out of the backfield. So that includes him playing at either fullback or tailback, or even sometimes a lone single back there behind quarterback Derek Carr. And since then, he has not seen double-digit snaps out of the backfield for the other 4 games that he appeared in this season. Remember, of course, he was injured week 4 early in that game up against the Atlanta Falcons. Maybe things were kind of heading that way. Missed week 3, 5, 6, and 7. But even if you look at the 4 games that he has appeared in, no double-digit snaps in the backfield since week 2. Instead, you've seen him a lot more playing kind of in line at tight end, playing in the slot, or playing out wide as a tight end / wide out as a pass catcher for the most part has sort of been his focus. And then over the course of the last 2 weeks, you've seen 7 snaps for him at quarterback, which is more than he received in the previous 4 games. So you're kind of seeing him get back to a little bit more of a tight end and wildcat quarterback kind of role. But I think getting him back involved in the backfield would help a ton. New Orleans found some pretty good success on the ground last week. Certainly could have been better, but they found some success, particularly in the first half in that game. And only had 2 snaps for Taysom out of the backfield in that one. So I wouldn't be surprised to see the Saints maybe lean back in on Taysom Hill as a runner out of the backfield a bit more here against Cleveland to help the run game get going. So you have that mix-in complement that you can give between Alvin Kamara, who can run outside the tackles, and then Taysom Hill, who you can run in between the tackles. And that gives you a little bit of a more balanced rushing approach, which then forces the Cleveland Browns to stay true to the run game in their defense, therefore not allowing Miles Garrett to so freely pin his ears back. Now, obviously, there's going to be a couple of other things to implement there, right? The Saints' offense, best offense might be their defense. Keeping points off the board from Cleveland is going to have to be a big part of this conversation, so you can continue to run the football if you're the New Orleans Saints. But if you think about just ways to alleviate a little bit of pressure and the pressure that a guy like Miles Garrett can provide, adding some wrinkles with Taysom Hill and the run game, I think could go a long way if you're able to do those successfully. We looked at and broke down a play. I still got to do the film study for the insiders, but we broke down a play in yesterday's episode of a play that could have gone. It was a second and 8 late in the game, the second to final. It was the penultimate play that the Saints ran on offense in that game, to where it was a 4-yard rush by Taysom Hill coming from the quarterback spot of the usual quarterback power with the fullback motion, the things that they typically do. And it was one block away in the second level of being a huge breakaway run. And then all of a sudden, we're talking about a much more successful run game for the New Orleans Saints based on that. But they didn't get that run. So do they miss that block again? Do they miss a different block? You know what I mean? Like the 1/11th of it all, as Darren Rizzi, interim head coach, likes to talk about, has to be in a better place this week in terms of execution and all those other things. But I think that it can be. I think that it should be. And I think that leaning into the run game, leaning into some of the wrinkles that you can create over an offense are going to be the best way to kind of free yourself up to provide the quote unquote uncarded looks that we talked about in yesterday's episode that the New Orleans Saints would provide on defense. You can provide those uncarded looks over on offense. And I think you get an opportunity to maybe catch this Cleveland Browns defense off guard. And that's going to be a good way for the New Orleans Saints to go in this matchup. Another thing that I think you can do in this game is get the tight ends a little bit more involved. The Cleveland Browns don't allow a ton of reception yards to tight ends so far this season. In fact, they're pretty close to the bottom of the NFL when it comes to defending that, or top of the NFL when it comes to defending that position group, bottom of the NFL when it comes to how much yardage they allow to that position group. But if you're able to find ways to get Foster Moreau, to get Juwan Johnson a little bit more active in this game, and then be able to take the top off after you've been able to run the football and attack the middle of the field with your running backs, Taysom Hill, and the tight ends, then all of a sudden you look at the opportunities to target Marquez Valdes-Scantling down the field again, then you're cooking, right? You're cooking over an offense, and that can certainly help you create a little bit of a boost by keeping that pass rush, keeping that Cleveland Browns defense back on its heels a little bit, and not allowing them to turn into kind of an attacking model in terms of their ability to be able to pin their ears back and be able to come after you because they know what you're doing, because you're either trailing or your run game's not working or whatever. So if you're able to create those opportunities, I think that goes a long way for this New Orleans Saints team. So wrinkles on defense made the difference last week, but I think wrinkles on offense are going to be necessary for a win this week against the Cleveland Browns. Coming up next, I want to take a look over at the Cleveland Browns side of things, and the biggest threat, which of course is familiar face, Jameis Winston. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, where you can go to tackle the rest of this NFL season. Right now, new customers will get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. It's that simple. New customer, put down $5, you win that bet, boom, $150 in bonus bets. Then you can download the FanDuel Sportsbook app and give you access to things like live betting in the NFL. You can also check out the latest stats, play-by-play, and more, all in the same place where you place your bets. All you got to do is go to FanDuel.com to get started today. The New Orleans Saints still favored, but the line is creeping, moving a little bit in this one. Still favored at home, 1.5-point favorites at home up against the Cleveland Browns. Start off as 3.5-point favorites, and then that has been kind of bet a little bit lower here. So if you want to get in on that, Saints' ability to cover, inability to cover, however you're feeling about it, you can head over to FanDuel.com to get started today. And again, get $150 in bonus bets. If your first $5 bet wins, never waste a hunch. Make every moment more with an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Today's episode also brought to you by our friends over at Prize Picks, the easiest and most fun way to play daily fantasy sports. Over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings. Prize Picks is the best place to go, and it's accessible to fantasy sports accessible to all. It's awesome because you don't have to be a spreadsheet wizard to be able to win here. It's just you picking more or less than the prize picks projections on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 100 times your entry. It's that simple. So they give you a receiving yards for Jamar Chase, for instance, 79.5. You pick more or less. Patrick Mahomes, more or less than 1.5 passing touchdowns. Boom. It's that simple. You get those right, you're going up to 100 times your money back. So go and check them out today. Download the app and use the code LOCKEDONNFL so you can get $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. That's $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup with the promo code LOCKEDONNFL. It's Prize Picks. Run your game. All right, family. The New Orleans Saints have another revenge game opportunity coming up. We've already seen guys like Lonnie Johnson Jr. earlier this season, even though he didn't really get an opportunity to play. But this is the big one, right? New Orleans Saints former quarterback Jameis Winston in Cleveland took over for Deshaun Watson, who went down with the Achilles injury. We were talking about on this show that Cleveland Browns fans were going to be chanting for Jameis Winston to be their starter by week 5. I think they were chanting for Jameis Winston to be their starter by week 2, but wasn't able to actually get that done up until, of course, Deshaun Watson goes down with the injury. And then all of a sudden now Jameis Winston's leading the way the rest of the way, including going into this game up against the New Orleans Saints. So a bit of a revenge game. Yeah, Dennis Allen's gone, but still a revenge game for Jameis Winston, who wasn't brought back here in New Orleans, took the opportunity to go and work with the Cleveland Browns and debuted like gangbusters, right? Came out in that very same game that Deshaun Watson and Dorian Thompson-Robinson went down with injury, a rare emergency third quarterback call up from the inactives list for Jameis Winston in that game. He ends up going in, throwing a touchdown late, comes back up against the Baltimore Ravens, throws 3 touchdowns in that game, and then follows it up with a 3-interception performance against the Los Angeles Chargers. So which version of Jameis Winston shows up to the Superdome is potentially the biggest threat because you just don't know exactly what to expect. So you got to force Jameis Winston into making mistakes. Get him into one mistake, he'll follow up with more. If you're able to do that, then you're going to be in a much better position. But boy, if you let him catch fire, then all of a sudden you're in trouble. And of course, the Cleveland Browns also had another big threat come back to their lineup that some would say is an even bigger threat than Jameis Winston. But I think that the on-offedness of Jameis Winston is a big-time threat because you just don't know what to expect. But another guy to watch is going to be running back Nick Chubb. Now, Nick Chubb coming back to the team over the course of the past few weeks, it hasn't been the most successful return for the running back thus far. He's worked his way back over the course of these last couple of games, no doubt about that, but has an average better than 3.3 yards per carry so far in this season. He averaged 2.6 up against the Chargers last week, 3.3 up against Baltimore the week before that, and then just 2.0 yards per carry, 22 yards on 11 carries in their game against the Cincinnati Bengals right before that. So 3 games back and in 3 kind of okay situations for him so far, but definitely don't want to let Nick Chubb get going up against your offense this week or your defense this week, if you're the New Orleans Saints. That ends up changing the entire complexion of the game if that happens, right? You get Nick Chubb rushing for over 100 yards, then all of a sudden you're probably looking at a Jameis Winston that's not seeing much pressure because the Saints defense is having to go and do what we were just talking about, what the Saints offense needs to force Cleveland's defense to do, which is respect the run game. And then they're not able to rush the passer as much. We already know the New Orleans Saints are not very much a pressure generating defense. Now they were a little bit better last week, kind of getting away from the scheme, all the games and stunts and twists and things like that they can run on the defensive line, and getting to a little bit more of the fundamentals, hand placement, winning violently, block sheds, run gaps, run fits, all those other things. That seemed to benefit them. 3 sacks, 2 forced fumbles up against the Atlanta Falcons and Kirk Cousins. But if the run game is able to get going for Cleveland and they're able to put points on the board, which is where Atlanta struggled last week, they struggled mightily to put points on the board to the Saints' benefit. That's going to force the Saints into a situation where they're not going to be able to put as much pressure on the opposing quarterback and instead are going to have to get back on their heels and defend the run game. So you don't want to give Jameis Winston that type of comfort because then he'll start to kind of chew you up. And so you don't want that to be the case. So you got to force him into mistakes. You got to get pressure, all those other things. Now, I will say this about the New Orleans Saints pressure unit last week. I thought they did a very, very good job And what they did basically was challenge the Atlanta Falcons and Kirk Cousins to move past his first progression and hold on to the football. And I think that's what you're going to see New Orleans try to do to Jameis Winston again this week over on the defensive side. They're going to try to take away the first read, make Jameis Winston read through his progressions and either force him into a panic mistake or end up getting after him, with the pass rush. Now, Jameis Winston can scoot. He can get away. He can escape. He can do things. He's hard to take down. He's a big old dude and everything. So you got to make sure that when you get to him and that you bring him down if you're the New Orleans Saints defense. But I think that has to be the recipe, right? Pressure with the front four, drop 8, get the coverage there, and force Jameis Winston to read the defense and move through his progressions if you get him into obvious passing situations, particularly on third down, things like that. Saints were really successful on third down defense last week. They took a team that was the number 7 ranked third down conversion team in the 3 weeks leading up to week 10 and then turned them into a bottom feeder when it came to the inability to convert third downs in Atlanta. You're looking to do something similar here to the Cleveland Browns by dropping back into those zones on third down, forcing the quarterback to read the defense, move through the progressions, not allowing the receivers to just run straight lines across the field and those crossing routes, those man beater routes and things like that. Saints did a good job of kind of avoiding that last week. That'll be imperative for them again this week. Here's the other thing to keep an eye out on is that the Saints and the Cleveland Browns kind of offensive lines rank pretty close to one another in terms of quarterback pressure percentage surrendered. Saints rank 14th according to the Next Gen Stats. The Cleveland Browns 15th according to the Next Gen Stats. So they're right around the same place. The big difference, though, is what the defenses on the opposite side bring. While the Cleveland Browns defense is a number 3 ranked pressure rate in the NFL, generating pressure on 40.7% of their pass rush opportunities, the New Orleans Saints is 5th from the bottom, number 28 in the NFL on just 30.3. The only teams below them are the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Arizona Cardinals, the Carolina Panthers, and the Atlanta Falcons. You'll notice that 2 of those teams are teams that the New Orleans Saints just recently played. The Carolina Panthers, who of course they lost to in Carolina, and then the bottom feeder in this category, the Atlanta Falcons, who the Saints offensive line performed impressively well against last week. So now you have to answer the question, has the Saints offensive line gotten better? Did they really perform better last week, or did they just go up against not so great talent when it came to that Atlanta Falcons pass rush? But as we focus on we'll get to that in a little bit when we get to more of the Browns defense, but it does raise that question while we're here. But the Saints will need to generate more pressure going into this game for sure than they have in terms of their average over the course of the season. They are not a team that has been massively successful there. But look, last week, 48.8% of Kirk Cousins' dropbacks were under pressure because of what the New Orleans Saints were able to generate. So with Brian Young now leading that defensive line, with the Saints and kind of simplifying their pass rush plan and everything, their pass rush packages, their pressure packages, all that, did that actually have the benefit that we thought that it would, that we think it has going into this game? That's certainly something that we'll find out against a pretty solid offensive line for the Cleveland Browns. So definitely a couple things to watch there. Your biggest threats are going to be Jameis Winston, Nick Chubb, but if you can get pressure and keep the run game, at least keep a cap on it a little bit, then you're going to be able to play yourself into some advantageous situations, because while Jameis Winston is the biggest threat when he's on, he can become your defense's biggest asset when he's not. So you got to force him into that side of the category. Coming up next, let's take a look at the New Orleans Saints offensive side up against the Cleveland Browns defense. What do the Cleveland Browns like to do, and how can the New Orleans Saints exploit it? We'll get to that next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by Ultimate Pro Football GM. They are back, and now they've added an amazing new game mode that I can't wait to tell you about. Ultimate GM, of course, is the game that allows you to be able to step into the shoes of a football franchise's general manager and lead it to glory. Well, now it has a head coach career mode as well. So a game where you're typically looking to build your dynasty by drafting players, signing free agents, hiring coaching staff. Now you get to call offensive plays during the games as well. You got to go and check out Ultimate Pro Football GM. It is easy to find. It's easy to play. It's realistic. It's super fun. And one of my favorite things about it is that you can play it anywhere. It's 100% playable offline. and it's completely free. So you can play it whenever and wherever you want. And right now, we can even give you a little bit of help here. A special offer just for you. Use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL in all caps in the game store, and you'll receive a free boost to your franchise. And make sure that you get it, because this perk will jumpstart your play and give you the advantage that you'll want in creating a dynasty. So to download the game, head over to ultimate-gm.com or look it up in your app stores. That's Ultimate Pro Football GM. Start your dynasty today. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The Cleveland Browns defense has been a little underwhelming so far this season, but make no doubt about it, it might be down. It's not out, because there's still a lot of talent over on that defensive side of the football. And it all starts with the guy that we've already kind of discussed a little bit in today's show, in Miles Garrett. That for me is going to be the biggest piece for the New Orleans Saints, is going to be the head-to-head matchup between Miles Garrett and rookie offensive tackle Taliese Fuaga. Now, of course, Garrett will move around and all those other things, but for the most part, he'll be matched up with Taliese, the young rookie. So what is it that makes Miles Garrett such a threat? Well, one of the biggest things when it comes to Miles Garrett so far has been his ability to generate pressure quickly. So he right now ranks with 26 quick pressures this season. Quick pressures are defined by pressures that get to the quarterback in 2.5 seconds or less, right? So not real opportunity for a quarterback to be able to sit back and read and do all those other things. And on top of that, he also has the second quickest pass rush get-off time in the NFL right now as well, according to Next Gen Stats, amongst players with at least 150 pass rushes, getting off that line of scrimmage at just 0.7 seconds. 0.7 seconds. Pretty impressive there. So that's going to be the big thing that you're going to be looking for here. He's got a 21.5% pressure rate so far this season, which is individually the second highest in the NFL. So he's absolutely still very much a threat, as he always has been, when it comes to pass rushers and defense in the NFL and opposing offenses in the NFL. Now, compare that to rookie offensive tackle Taliese Fuaga, who has performed very well. He's allowed just a 7.8% pressure rate so far this season. It actually ranks 8th among all offensive tackles, left tackles in particular in the NFL, that have played at least 150 pass blocking snaps. Not just rookies. That's every left tackle in the NFL. Fuaga ranks 8th with 7.8% pressure rate allowed. That's really, really good. Where he has struggled, though, is going up against players that can generate quick pass rushes. Now, remember, we just talked about Miles Garrett generating the most quick pressures so far this season by an individual player. Well, when it comes down to Fuaga, he has given up the third quickest average time on pressures at 2.55 seconds. So when he does give up pressure, he gives up quick pressure. He struggles against guys that can create that kind of pressure. He'll outlast you if you're trying to hand-to-hand fight him and do all this other stuff. He'll outlast you when it comes to all that. But when it comes to guys that are able to maybe quick bend, run the arc, all those other things, that's where he struggled a little bit. But he allowed 0 pressures on 21 pass blocking snaps against the Falcons last week. How much of that was Taliese Fuaga continuing to develop, which we have seen him continue to develop. There's no doubt about that. But also how much of that has to do with the fact that the worst 2 pass rushes in the NFL for teams are the last 2 teams that the New Orleans Saints have played, the Carolina Panthers and the Atlanta Falcons. This is going to be a huge test for the New Orleans Saints offensive line and for Taliese Fuaga. I think the biggest thing you're going to see in this game that's going to help with all that is going to be by not allowing Fuaga to be one-on-one with Garrett all the time. You're going to have to give him a chip. You're going to have to give him some help and stuff like that. So watch for the tight end to be lined up over on the left side. Watch for if there's an unbalanced backfield that's weighted towards the left side a little bit of help. And also, don't be surprised to see Garrett move around to try to also get pressure over on Trevor Penning, which, by the way, I do want to give a shout out to Trevor Penning because he has more than halved his pressure rate from last year. He was allowing over 16% pressure rate, or he was allowing an over 16% pressure rate last season playing at left tackle. He has more than halved that going into, or so far this season, in his move over to right tackle. He's been, for just to call it what it is, he's been outstanding so far. It's one of the reasons why no one's talking about him is because of how well he's played. So look for the Cleveland Browns to challenge both those guys. You got a rookie on one side, and you got a guy with a history of giving up pressures on the other side, but is vastly improved so far this season. So shout out to Trevor Penning when it comes to that for sure, because that has been that's been a really solid piece in terms of what New Orleans has been able, what New Orleans has been able to do in terms of developing those guys. John Benton, offensive line coach, has done a great job there. So that's what you're looking at when it comes to kind of the biggest threat over on the defense for the Cleveland Browns. The other two players that you're watching for are players that are right now dealing with injury, concussions, things like that. So Denzel Ward, of course, one of the better safeties in the NFL when healthy, has just suffered what was his 6th confirmed career concussion up against the Baltimore Ravens. So this is now 2 weeks ago, right? Because he had the game against Baltimore. Then you had, if you're the Browns, that game against the Chargers, which he did not play in. And then he returned to practice like late in that week, but didn't play. And then, of course, there was the bye week this past week for Cleveland. So he should be back, I expect, this week. And then another guy that's also been dealing with that as well, not concussion related, but neck injury related, is Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, the former Notre Dame linebacker that's now with the Cleveland Browns. Those are going to be two other names to watch. A very good threat at all three levels, at least for the Cleveland Browns as they move forward here. We've seen Owusu-Koramoah be one of the few players in the NFL we've seen so far play with the Guardian cap on, with the silk slip over the top and everything. So he's been doing the things necessary to kind of take care of himself and everything. But he and Denzel Ward are guys that have both been dealing with injury, but can be big-time game changers in this matchup against New Orleans. So those are going to be two guys to absolutely watch in this game. Again, Cleveland's defense has not been spectacular. They're right there middle of the road in terms of passing yards. They're right there middle of the road in terms of rushing yards allowed. They allow over 4 yards per carry in the run game. Maybe a place where New Orleans will be able to take advantage a little bit there. But for the most part, this is still a very talented defense in terms of the players that they have. It just has not performed up to the standard that you expect. So look for the New Orleans Saints to attack, to be aggressive. I think that's what you have to be up against this Cleveland Browns defense. If you know they're not playing up to standard, challenge them, go after them, attack them. And so look for Derek Carr to do that. Derek Carr completed 4 of his 7 downfield passes, according to Next Gen Stats last week, for 143 yards and a touchdown against the Falcons, averaged 20.4 yards per attempt on those attempts as well. That's a vast improvement from where he was and where the New Orleans Saints quarterbacks as a whole have been from weeks 3 through 9, where they average just 8.9 yards. 8.9 on targets, 10 or more yards downfield. It goes to show you how many of those they didn't get in those situations. So look for New Orleans to attack, look for them to go after them, and to see what it is that they're able to get going in their run game. I think that's going to be the biggest thing and the biggest way to kind of keep this Browns defense from getting back on track, getting comfortable. And if you can keep the Browns defense from doing that, it's going to force the Browns offense to lean more on their passing game, lean more on big plays, lean more on explosivity over the offensive side. And if you could do that, then you might be able to force some mistakes, some, bad habits, things like that out of Jameis Winston. And then you have to be opportunistic as a defense to take advantage of that. So look for a lurking, roaming honey badger again this week as well, playing a little bit more over the top. So those are kind of the biggest threats and some of the other things to watch for in this game when it comes to the Cleveland Browns. Coming up in tomorrow's episode, Jeff Lloyd of Locked On Browns is going to be here to help us break it all down even more, taking a look at this matchup, and we'll welcome in the enemy perspective in tomorrow's episode. We appreciate you very much for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Make sure you go and check out Locked On NFL as well for all the biggest stories around the league. Tony and Tyler, 2 episodes a day, bringing it to you there over at Locked On NFL. We appreciate you very much for making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing, how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust you, that nation, I'll holla at you.